digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined by the lovely Sam Watts from Make Real. We have with us James Turnbull, and we also have with us Dan from Happy Finish. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello there.
Right, James, I'm really aware that I left this big gap about where you work because I'm not quite sure which title I'm giving you and which place I'm saying that you're actually from, other than I know that you're in Brighton. So...
sunny Brighton, yeah, it's fabulous. I work at the Old Market, which is a venue here, and head up a program called Tom Tech, which looks at arts and technology and the messy edge of the two worlds.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dan, why don't you explain a little bit more about Happy Finish?
Yeah, sure. So I imaginative title of Chief Interactive Officer here at Happy Finish, which means I look after the rabble that creates virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and a peppering of AI experiences, generally for brands, but we do a lot for art installations and ever more sort of digital out-of-home experiences.
Wonderful. And Sam, whilst I said that you're from Make Real, there are also a vast array of other things that you have a finger in the pie of. Would you care to share a little bit about what else you're doing with the lovely likes of Tamika?
Yes, sure. The virtual pies. So I am a VR evangelist, educator, outreach, encourager, use of technologies, etc. Some of that is in a corporate businessy side. Some of that is in a fun gamey side. So we co-own Tamika, who you had Mark on from the previous podcast. We made Radial G, which was a launch title a couple of years ago, many moons in the distant past of virtual reality history. And our new title, Loco Dojo, is available now. And then we're looking at the next one as how we can blend, luckily for today's subjects, location-based virtual reality, social, multi-user entertainment.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, gentlemen. So, as Sam alluded to that, today's topic is all about location-based. And by that, because location-based is quite a broad statement. So we're going to make it really clear. We're not talking about theme parks here. We're not talking about these big, vast theme parks with their roller coasters and their virtual roller coasters. Oh, no. We are talking about these locations that are much more artsy and theatrical in nature. Much more up James's streets, actually. And what I'm curious to kind of discuss today, really, is where we think the future of these collaborative and social immersive entertainment experiences are going. Now, first of all, I'm not going to keep on referring to VR and AR separately, or MR or XR or any of the other Rs. I'm just going to say immersive entertainment because, frankly, I can't keep doing alphabet soup. So... First of all, we'll be calling it immersive entertainment experiences. But second of all, I am kind of curious, James, starting from your perspective and specifically talking about it from a theatre perspective. One of the things that I think a lot of people who are trying to get into more kind of warehouse scale and arena scale VR and immersive kind of don't really think about is actually the amount of existing venues that already exist when it comes to theatre venues that could potentially be integrating immersive technologies and immersive experiences into their locations. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective whether or not this is something that, from the theatre side of the industry, there is that perception of an opportunity to integrate these new technologies, be that, virtual reality or augmented reality or even volumetric holographic projection. Do you think it's something that people are kind of open to?
I think they're open to it. I don't think enough people really have explored it or know about it yet. So it's very much seen as a not for them type of thing in the theatre industry. We deal with live a lot. So if something's digital or recorded or looks a bit like a game or looks a bit like a film, then they go, well, that's probably not for us. And it involves people that we don't normally work with. However, it's a huge opportunity. What the venue network offers is venues tend to be where we go to experience our culture historically. So we go see gigs, we see theatre, we see opera, we see comedy, all that sort of thing. Where do we come together to share cultural experiences? There's a big network there. They've got a big audience reach. It's, our buildings have marketing teams whose job it is to keep in touch with all the local people to invite them to stuff. So it feels like there's a natural link between those two worlds. If you can make the right product, or if you can work with the right content in some way that gets enough people through, I guess, or it becomes relevant as a shared experience in VR.
So here's the rub, and you kind of touched on it there a little bit, James, which is that for a lot of people who are creating VR content or immersive content, there is this kind of assumption, and I'm making broad sweeping statements here, but I'm going to say that certainly from the gaming side, and also to a certain extent the 360 film side of the industry, there is this assumption that to experience something in VR is an insular, isolated experience because you put this lovely black box or whichever colour box on your head and you can't really kind of see what's going on around you in the rest of the world unless it's an AR experience. But that if you are experiencing it, it's an insular experience that's designed specifically for you and you alone. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, Dan, when you're talking with clients and you're talking with, people who are thinking about creating this content, whether or not you ever have these types of conversations where you're trying to explain to them actually that VR isn't about an insular experience. It's not about singular experience. Do you ever get into those kind of conversations? Do you find that most people just want to focus on insular?
Yeah, of course. That sort of topic of conversation comes up a lot. And as we know, virtual reality can be a very individual and singular experience. And in many ways, that's part of why lots of our clients' brands and charities do utilize it as a medium to convey a very specific message to an individual. So you're enclosed, you're there, you're completely consuming. And the only way you can't consume that content really is by shutting your eyes. What's the point in that? So there are many benefits to it being on one hand a singular experience. But it really depends on the use case. And we're working on an immersive theatre experience now, which goes live in London in the next few weeks, which, the term we're using is layered reality. There are physical components to that. There's acting talent, there's audio components, and there are VR and mixed reality components happening there. And you go through in groups of 6. So really, I think it's about looking at the flavour of content you want to create and sort of the experience you want to give. But for sure, what we're seeing is a greater interest in shared experiences. I think what we're seeing is the experience economy starting to creep into the immersive tech world. Okay.
So I'm curious then from your perspective, Sam, because when I think about these kind of collaborative, shared, immersive experiences, one of the first experiences that always pops to my mind is the Bus to Mars, which was done by Rush Sadhu and the Framestore team. And when we look at that as an immersive tech experience, a lot of people will look at that and kind of go, well, hold on a minute, there weren't any headsets on any of the kids, so how is that a VR experience? And yet the entirety of the entire bus of kids were in an immersive environment on the surface of Mars. So from your perspective, when you are talking about these experiences and developing these experiences, do you think of it as a HMD requirement, or do you think of this as the modification of the individual's perception of reality?
I think, there's a whole range and scale of immersion. And when we started out 10 years ago working with full flight simulators, we weren't talking about head-mounted content. We were looking at multi-channel projected displays and caves and wraparound screens. And a lot of that is coming back now, as long as the majority of your vision is filled with the content and you're able to forget where you are and be taken away wherever you are upon the story or the narrative being told. You don't necessarily have to have a headset on. We see it as a case of lowercase virtual reality versus uppercase virtual reality with headsets.
It's quite funny that you use that phraseology, because there are some people who haven't heard those phrases yet. And when you say things like lowercase virtual reality, they're kind of sitting there going, what does that mean exactly? What have I missed?
Well, we've been working with civil aviation and, building site construction companies who have been doing this for decades. And, to a certain degree have been doing it with head-mounted displays, just because the last phase in the 90s failed commercially to go mainstream as we all know, NASA and scientists and military, etc., have still carried on working with their own headsets. It's just nowadays the headsets that cost $300 are infinitesimally more powerful, higher specification, etc., than the ones that were costing $30,000, in the 90s. So the potential to go mainstream is certainly larger, but if you look back at what some of the technology did then, we're not really doing anything different now. It's just cheaper, and all the same problems and same challenges are still there, mostly encouraging people to strap a massive black box to their face.
It's interesting that you say this, because this is one of the things that I end up kind of ranting about an awful lot, actually, is this the notion that the VR industry is not as new as people would like to think it is. And in fact, as you rightly say, the US Air Force and NASA and Disney have been working on this for at least 3 decades. And so there is an awful lot of learning that is already out there in the world. And it does bring me to this kind of curiosity of why there are so many people who still seem to think that the current market for VR is going to be consumer based, whereas actually location based entertainment and VR arcading and VR esports offer a much more potentially rewarding revenue stream with much less effort when it comes to the content than necessarily trying to publish a VR game and distribute a VR game in the world. I say this, Sam, bearing in mind that you obviously have been there and done that with Tamika and Radio G.
Yeah, and we're doing it again now as Make Real with Loco Dojo. And if you look at, obviously, arcades, video game arcades were once very popular, and it's a very social place you would go together to play games, and it'd be a big competitive element. The rise of the virtual reality arcade, which is kind of like sort of the first stage of LPVR, is becoming more and more popular. And yeah, it's now becoming viable for developers to target content specifically at these venues, rather than having to get huge budgets to create a game which has to be perceived to have all that depth and longevity and repeated play. If you're designing something, it is just designed to be a 10, 15 minute experience, which is your typical sort of VR arcade session time, then you can really hone and make a really tight gameplay with tight gameplay loops that gives that competitive element and that sort of one more go factor, but also, with leaderboards and challenge side of things, brings it into a social environment for people to play against each other or better each other's scores, going back to the original purpose of arcades.
So this is one of the things I find really interesting, is this kind of, I'm gonna be quite bold and say this misunderstanding of the concept of an arcade, a gaming arcade, and where VR arcades sit. And I say this on the basis of I speak to a lot of VR arcade owners, and there seems to be this obsession with how many HMDs can I get into the building and how many people can I get through those HMDs in terms of, I'm going to charge by the minute or by the hour or, whatever the time unit is per headset. And what they've kind of missed is the fact that actually a really strong part of the VR, sort of the game arcade experience, wasn't about the person who played the game. It was actually about you, watching your mates play the game or cheering on your mates or, smack talking whilst 2 of the people were playing or whatever the thing was. But it wasn't this requirement that every single person in the building had to be playing a game. And yet with VR arcading, certainly the current kind of bout of VR arcade owners seem to be very obsessed with this notion that every single person that visits their premises must be inside a VR headset in order to have had a fully gratifying experience in the building. And I find this quite interesting because it kind of illustrates a lack of understanding of audience and what the desire for an audience is within the context of a VR arcade. And I'm curious from your perspective, James, when we talk about audiences, obviously from a theatre perspective and from a kind of a gigs perspective, it's a very different kind of audience. It's a very different kind of expectation from that audience when they're in the building. But do you see any parallels or similarities here in terms of that kind of crossover between VR arcading versus location-based entertainment?
But it's quite interesting what you were just saying there, in that we had about 5,000 people through sort of paying VR experiences last year as part of a mini festival we put on. Mm-hmm. And what we learned a lot as a venue is how do you get people, it's as important how you get them to approach the work put the headset on, get the gear on, get briefed, and then experience it, and then what happens afterwards as well. So actually, if you look at just what's in the HMD or the digital content, you're missing a huge part of the experience. So much like when people come here to see theatre or comedy, they're greeted at the door, they go to the box office, they meet their friends at the bar, all before you see the show, and then after the show you stay for a drink. So you need to think of it as that whole evening context, I think, to make this sort of stuff compelling or work for people.
It's interesting that, because that's very similar as well, obviously, to the theme park experience, which is, you queue up for what is essentially maybe 2 minutes worth of a ride, but it's the process of the queuing where you feel the excitement, and they have the themed kind of area where the people are queuing in. I don't know the last time anybody was at Disneyland, but you can easily wait in a queue for about 2 hours, whether that's a Merlin park or a Disney park. And it's not necessarily all about the stepping onto the physical ride itself, but a lot of it has to do with that process as you are queuing and what you're seeing as you kind of move forward into that queue. And I know that Space Mountain was a great one where they used to have all those health warnings as you got closer and closer to the front. People got quite stressed out, and you'd have people kind of stepping out of the queue going, I don't think I can go on this ride. It sounds quite stressful. And then when they got to the front, it was like, actually, it's not that bad. It's just little boost at the top of the ride, and that's pretty much it. So I'm kind of curious, do you think that perhaps there are people who are missing the trick when it comes to this kind of anticipation and build-up process that theme parks are so incredibly good at, and then that the theatre world is so incredibly good at, that maybe the VR arcade owners could take a lesson or two from?
Well, I don't know. I think the important thing with this industry is it appeals across sector. So the technology just sort of smashes down walls between different ways that people enjoy their culture or what they hang out with. So what you might want to have a more traditional VR game arcade, and what gamers might want is probably completely different to a theatre audience. So if you're doing it, really, people came last year. I would hope most of them came because of the content. So we were looking at how you see nature through digital eyes, effectively. So a lot of people came because they're interested in nature, and there was a few people who came because of the VR. But really, the tech just wasn't interesting to them that much. Just going, I've got a headset on. It was the reviews were all about what was the content like, how did it make me feel, what was it like at the venue, how was I looked after. So I think it depends on what sort of market you're appealing to. It sounds like Dan, your piece that's opening in London will play along those sort of lines. Really, it's that whole multi-layered immersion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. I mean, and there will be different flavors of this, of how immersive tech is used commercially. VR arcades is one, I think, very viable route for sure. But the sort of stuff that I'm finding really interesting at the moment, and it picks up on your point, Tanya, about that sort of, I guess the excitement is not just about the queuing. It's actually when you book a ticket. Mm-hmm. It's actually when you're reading reviews in Huffington Post or Time Out for an experience that you then collectively get a group of friends together and agree to go to that experience. And of course, it's experiences, the digital elements, and it's the more layered physical elements, and the acting and the writing and everything. It's sort of the more traditional theatrical approach to content creation that helps to create that layered experience. And then, you know what? It's actually the kudos you get from being in the pub a week later and telling your friends about what an amazing experience you had. So I think it's way closer to what that type of thing. What really focusing on at the moment is way closer to sort of the Broadway Shaftesbury Avenue sort of new theatrical production than a VR arcade. But I think both are viable, and I think there's room for both in the marketplace.
It's interesting you say that, because obviously The Void with their Star Wars Secrets of the Empire experience is very much what you're talking about, where people get very excited just from the point of booking the ticket and getting that team of 4 mates together. And by the time they get down to the Westfield Shopping Centre where it is currently hosted, there's already a degree of excitement there that far outweighs, just strolling into an arcade and jumping on a game. That there is this whole sentiment of, immersing themselves within the franchise, immersing themselves within the narrative universe that they're about to go and enter. And then coming out and being able to talk about that as a shared experience and telling their mates about the fact that they've done it. I mean, the amount of people's Facebook posts that I've seen of, we just come out of Star Wars, the Secrets of the Empire and, toting their guns and all the rest of it. And that's really, I think, one of the things that a lot of people perhaps aren't facilitating is the conversation. And I'm curious from your perspective on this, Dan, because in an ironic kind of way, the transmedia industry have been doing this for many decades with what they would refer to as ARG. And this idea of fusing, physical world elements with digital world elements and kind of gamifying, if you like, I hate that word, gamifying, but kind of gamifying the narrative story and the participation within that narrative story.
Yeah.
They've been doing it for an awfully long time. And so in many ways, the kind of key to success for a really good ARG has always been community and the conversation between different people. And I don't know if anybody kind of recalls the original ARG that was put together for The Hunger Games, the first movie, where they literally created the 12 districts on social media, and they had people kind of, vying to be the mayor of each of these districts using their social media platforms and channels, and all sorts of different kind of Instagram elements and YouTube elements and all these different digital layers that they added in, but they made it very real. They made it very much about people's personal lives. And it was that community, it was that conversation that occurred. And I wonder if perhaps there isn't enough conversation that happens between people who are experiencing these things, who are getting it into these VR experiences, who then come out and don't really have anybody to talk to about it, or a community that they can kind of share with and who gets it,
I personally, I think it's happening. I think that it's just a matter of time. It's about adoption. It's about people more and more experiences that people go and have, not necessarily at home, VR arcades or immersive experiences like Somni that we're creating, or the sort of thing that we put in the top of the Shard. The slide at the top of the Shard. The more people have these experiences, the more they'll share the content, and it will just integrate into their general life and the social channels that they communicate. So eventually it'll be much like, I took a trip to the zoo and saw an amazing elephant. I took a trip to the Shard and I had an amazing VR experience. So I think it's just about it proliferating into the market a little bit more. But I think it's happening. I think the community is growing.
Okay. Sam, I'm curious from your perspective then, because Dan brings up, experiences like the Shard and kind of slide down the side of the Shard, which is a great experience, but terrifying if you're afraid of heights, like I am. But one of the things that I find interesting about that is that there is kind of a lack of narrative around something like that, because it is very much, I'm on the side of the Shard and I'm going down a, insanely tall helter-skelter. But it's not like there are any kind of key characters that you engage with or you empathize with, and it's not like you're the kind of hero in an epic adventure or anything like that. So there kind of feels like with many of these experiences that we hear about, there tends to be a lack of that narrative interconnection, if you like, that allows people to come together in the traditional gaming kind of way. Obviously you've worked on things like StarCraft and Guild Wars and what have you, where, the games community really do unite around that single narrative. What's your view on this?
I think a few of the points have been touched on already, in terms of how VR arcades operate. VR, or the current phase, was initially pushed really heavily as a gaming thing with like all action, shooters, stuff blowing up in your face, etc. And, focus on the technology and how cool it was. That, immediately puts a lot of people off. And then it puts off, there's a big divide between the gamers of those who want to be a console gamer, those who want to be a PC, those who are Xbox, those who are PlayStation, who are, choosing their camps. We've already seen people, fanboys and infighting Rift versus Vive versus PlayStation. And I think, sort of VR arcades were like a sort of direct response to that, in that people want this stuff, but it's either expensive, although, it's kind of around half the price it was a year ago now, or it's, they don't have space at home. So the VR arcade set up just to sort of allow people to experience the hardware. But, yes, it's got cheaper, but the space requirements are still there. So I say it hasn't really got much cheaper, because ultimately you need 250 grand plus to build that extension to build a VR room at home. But
you're not encouraging anybody listening to this with those kind of price tags.
Well, I mean, I am personally looking for a 3-bedroom house rather than a 2-bedroom house, so I can have one square room that's entirely empty, except for all the virtual universes I plan to fill it with. But location based and VR arcades at the moment, majority of them are just offering the experiences that you can get at home for people who can't get it at home, and they need to really, like what James and Dan sort of alluding to, is actually create a bespoke experience that you can't get at home. And it is more than just the experience you have when you've got the headset on. It's the lead up to, and it's the taking off and the after. I've not fortunately tried the Void yet, but I've booked the tickets, and that's the most excited I've ever been about planning a trip to a shopping centre. But I've read.
Come and talk to me when you've done it, and we'll compare notes, because I'm not going to ruin it for you.
We're taking all 12 of us, so we've got 3 times 4 sessions, so it should be interesting. But we're still testing the waters. I mean, it's been covered elsewhere. Still, when we do demos, when we do expos and events and stuff like that, you're still looking at 8 or 9 out of 10 people who are trying VR for the first time, and it makes it really hard to determine the sort of impact of the content. Are people losing their shit over the technology, or are they losing it over what you've actually created and just put them through? VR arcades are trying stuff out. Thankfully, more of them now are signing up to Steam commercial licenses, or working with Control V or VR Junkies or Springboard platforms to, have subscriptions, and developers actually see some of that revenue coming back, rather than early days when they were just setting up a Steam personal account.
Oh yeah, there was plenty of that going on.
Yeah, I mean, I visited 4 in Hungary recently, and apparently it's Hungarian law. They don't have to do commercial licenses, or they suddenly stop speaking English. Anyway, it's still early days, and people are still trying out. And we also don't know how much to charge. People complain about the price of beer. People complain about the price of cinema tickets. If you look at, people complain about the price of games, full stop. If you look at the average PlayStation group for PSVR on Facebook, most of the posts are, is X title worth Y amount? And it's how do you put a price on this? I've been to the Science Museum. I paid £7 to experience a 20-minute film of Tim Peake coming back from orbit. I've been up the Shard. I paid 15 quid for the slide experience, or Richie's plank experience reimagined with the Shard. How much value do we put on these things? And going back to the earlier point, when you're queuing up for Disney rides or theatre, you've got a physical thing in front of you. You can see what it is you're about to do. You can see people coming off of it. A lot of that is missing from location-based VR at the moment. Again, with the Void, I don't know how much there is in terms of build-up to when you actually put the headset on and experience it. I think getting dressed is part of the narrative. I'm not sure. I'll find out in a couple of weeks. But, a lot of VR arcades and a lot of places at the moment, because of cost and technology and faff, essentially, they're not doing, they're not making the most of mixed reality. They haven't got green screen set up. They haven't got live composite feeds of people in the experience showing them actually what they're doing in the experience. Partly, I don't know, maybe not to ruin it for others, but at the same time, it kind of doesn't have that build-up of excitement.
Some really interesting points there, Sam. I'm just picking up on my view, the commercial view around VR arcades, for me, is that it's a very short-term view at the moment. It's looking at a gap in the market which can be exploited quickly by leveraging off-the-shelf titles and just getting people in VR potentially for the first time. The long-term value proposition is not there. I mean, it's allowing people. It's like if my cousin Kevin had a VR headset, I could probably pop round to his and have the same experience. Long term, I think the business model won't hold true for VR arcades unless they add that value proposition, unless there are motion platform, unless there's more that you can do at home. And I think that's the real distinction between where the future commercially is. And just picking up on your point around pricing, that's a really interesting thing that we here at Happy Fitness really knee deep, waist deep in trying to work out at the moment. People will always complain about the price. It's just, I think it's human nature to think things are probably priced too expensive than they should be. But how we're judging that is, are we hitting the utilization rates and the penetration rates that we need to support the creation of a experience which has the value proposition? That's where we're at the moment. It's a very interesting time, because there is the risk that you overprice experiences. Some might say that the Star Wars Void experience is overpriced, but I think in general they're selling a lot of tickets. So
it's interesting you say this though, because I do think that VR in general and kind of immersive entertainment in general suffers from a lack of consumer understanding and perception about what the value of it should be. And it's interesting because if you look at the value of other forms of entertainment, people are not interested in paying as much as they would have in the past for any form of entertainment now. Music and the fact that in the old days you used to buy an entire album, and now people just want to buy a single track and they want to do it digitally. They don't want to necessarily physically own something anymore. And likewise with movies, people, Blockbuster Video in its day was kind of the thing. You would go and you would exchange, a box for another box, and there was a certain value that was attached to that box. Nowadays, people begrudge paying $1.99 to be able to watch it, a 1.5 hour movie online. So when you look at the context of people's value perception of entertainment, it's interesting that there is such a high price tag attached to some of the immersive entertainment experiences that we're seeing. And I do think that some of them are priced too high for the perception of the value that consumers think these things have, even though we within the industry understand that actually we kind of need to charge it at this basic minimum price, else we're not going to be able to sustain, being able to develop these things for you. So I do think it is an educational thing as well. I think that the consuming public need to understand actually what it takes to build these things right now.
Yeah, it's a really valid point.
Going back to your very early point, Tanya, in that a lot of VR arcades, are seemingly making the mistake of just shoving as many headsets in as possible. Similarly, when James and I have worked together over the past couple of years doing VR Lab and TomTech, it's, we have, between 16 and 18 setups, each with a different piece of content. But if you were to have it arranged so that you had just enough people to be able to experience every single one within a 2-hour slot or whatever, there's no way you can get enough people through to even make, sort of costs of just having the staff and people on the floor and the venue. So
exactly. It drives me nuts.
Fine line somewhere.
It drives me nuts. There's so many people who they go into these groups to talk about VR arcades, and I'm about to launch a VR click. How many headsets do I need? How many people do I need to run these headsets? How long do I need to be open for to get enough people through these headsets? And you're kind of sitting there, with your head in your hands, kind of thinking, if you keep thinking this way, you are not going to survive. There is no long-term viability. And it's exactly as Dan said, which is there needs to be something more. When somebody turns up to a VR arcade or a location-based entertainment, experience, there needs to be something they simply cannot get at home. And that has to be something that is either completely different content or an enhancement to the existing content that simply cannot be duplicated at home. And there are not enough people who are thinking about doing that right now. So I do think...
for us, we're looking at creating a VR arcade specific version of Loco Dojo because there's a lot of developers with the Steam commercial, which is a monthly subscription, making the mistake of going, oh, well, it's a VR arcade, let's charge double the price of a personal license. But then, they're assuming that VR arcade is going to have that title running every single minute of the day, and it's going to be worthwhile to the owner to pay that. Whereas, because we're looking at multi-user, we've halved the price because we want people to buy 4 seats monthly in order to, be able to offer the full multiplayer experience. But then conversely, in offering 4 multiplayer experience, it takes 40 minutes to an hour to play one full game. So a lot of VR arcades are now feeding back saying it's great, everyone loves it, but it's too long for a session. So we have to create a version for VR arcades specifically that, is predetermined to sort of last 10-15 minutes, only 3 rounds, takes out a lot of the sort of intricacies. Or similarly, like things like they want to use it as a final round in the pub quiz, and they want to be able to choose a specific mini game. So sort of customization options and that kind of thing. But it all goes back to the very early stuff we did with like RS Components and more sort of marketing and experiential brand work, where you are designing an event, how many attendees there are, and they want 5-minute experience tops, but that includes getting people in and out and experiencing it. So it's sort of tightening it up purely for the particular location and purpose.
I wonder if there isn't a justification, and I know that we've said this in a previous podcast before, but I wonder if there isn't an argument to suggest that there does need to be a dedicated communication channel between the developers and the arcade and location owners to actually work on this kind of customization of content and this dedicated content specifically for these types of locations. Because right now I feel that there isn't enough conversation going on between developers and arcade owners. And it is just a case of, well, I'll get a commercial license off Steam and, pick a couple of, top 5 games and boom, there we go. Versus actually talking to the developers and saying, what's possible? What can we do that's going to make this unique? And how do we get value out of each other rather than just, buying something off the shelf?
Well, a lot of them are still just ensuring they've got enough throughput to make ends meet rather than having a war chest of funds to actually create their own bespoke content. But the guys who run the VR Concepts, who I think they've now got 5 pubs, so they have permanent VR arcades set up. They do outreach with universities and colleges and do like game jams. So, they're looking to get some of their own bespoke content, okay, admittedly created probably cheaper than going to, a fully established developer, but they're certainly exploring ways of creating bespoke content that they will only have, and as encourage more footfall for people to come to them as opposed to some other VR arcade just running a Steam library.
And that's where the real value is, I think. But as always, gentlemen, we like to kind of ask you the big question. And so I put this to you. What is that significant single change that you think needs to occur? Be that a cultural change or a technological shift when it comes to moving us forward into this shared, collaborative, immersive entertainment future. What do you think is that one big thing that needs to happen? And I'm going to start with you, James.
Well, it's all about shared experience for me. So I think what can the advances in technology facilitate to get more people immersed at the same time or have a sense of each other in the world? So the ability to do that on the cheap, I mean, those things exist already, but they're very sort of hard and expensive and hacked together. So when can that technology is ubiquitous, then I think we can see a lot more interesting stories happening. Within that, from the cultural side of it, I sort of have 2. There's one from tech, and then the culture is really about new storytelling models for this medium. It doesn't fit to use a linear narrative. You can pick up some of the stuff from gaming and sort of branching narratives and sandbox and that sort of stuff. But if you need a compelling story to sit over the top, you need some of our greatest writers and directors and designers to sit and think about it. They're not necessarily already existing in the VR tech world, early adopter world. They might be from other art forms, from theatre or from dance or from opera, wherever they come from, or from TV. So we need to look at where we're sourcing our artists and how we're bridging across. The success will come out of collaboration across sector, I'm sure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sam, what's your view on this?
I've been making notes as we've been talking to try and come up with the one thing, and it could be cost, it could be easy of use, it could be range of experiences, it could be designing for home versus public. But I think ultimately, from 4 or 5 years of demoing and trying to entice the public to try on the headsets, is still, we're at the stage of the technology needs to be smaller, lighter, and make us look less dorky.
Okay. So just being able to fit in whilst wearing the technology. Okay.
Yeah.
Dan, what's your take on this?
I love the less dorky. Yes, I wish it doesn't take I wish it would be more than a headset to make me less dorky, I think. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think really it's just a matter of time, if I'm being honest. Time will allow those of us, and I think I'm amongst peers who are dedicated to the craft of creating experiences, will allow the experiences that us and those like us create to get out there and people, the audiences, to have those experiences that will really last with them and will mean that they want more and more. So yeah, I'm very positive in my outlook, and I think we just need time. Don't ask me how long.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about you. And we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, James?
So you can find us at tomtech __. Who's got an underscore? It's terrible, isn't it? It's TOMTECH_.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sam?
Well, sorry, James, but it's VR_Sam.
And Dan, what about your good self?
It's just to keep the theme going. It's at happy_finish on Twitter.
A beautiful team.
So many
Who said
underscores.
the underscore was dead? Not
So many underscores. Well, thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com